Hi there, welcome back to the second lecture for week 6 of the course on the Trinity. The goal of this lecture is to cover one of the key early Trinitarian debates that happened after the term homoousia was adopted, and then walk through the key Trinitarian distinctives as the church closes out the 4th century. One of the things I want to point out is within this lecture are at least 2 of the terms that will be on the vocab quiz. One of those is Homoian. That was transposed incorrectly by a TA when the course was getting set up. I'll be correcting that in the vocab notes or the study guide, I guess, for this lecture, and just keep that in mind. As we talked about in a previous lecture, the Council of Nicaea in 325 soundly condemned Arianism as a heresy and adopted the language of homoousia to talk about the relationship of God the Father to the Son. The Son, they said, wasn't some lesser God, but was fully and completely God, of the exact same stuff as God. While Nicaea established the doctrine of homoousia, it did not define it very well. The term ousia just means substance, and as we discussed in the last lecture, discussing God in terms of substances was problematic because it threatened the distinction between divine infinitude and the finite realm of substances. Enough people were uncomfortable with the outcome in Nicaea, and especially of the term homoousios, that they formed an alliance that has come to be known as the Homoian alliance. The thrust of the Homoian controversy was that they felt that Nicaea has tied God too closely to substance language, which was both confusing at one level and threatened divinity on another level. They also felt that the outcome in Nicaea made the Son too close to the Father. This closeness was a threat to divine simplicity. How, the Homoians argued, can God be simple if there are at least two persons in one substance? At the same time, Athanasius was one of the most influential thinkers in the church, and he kept reminding people about the limits of what we can know about God. Lacuna speaks to this extensively as well. Athanasius, as well as Lacuna, argue that God is ineffable, meaning unable to be fully described or characterized. For this reason, Athanasius cautioned that there are significant limits on what we can know about God at the level of theologica. Nicaea, Athanasius argued, gives us terms around which we can speak of God as God has been revealed to us, but it does not and cannot fully describe how this is actually happening within God. So, for Athanasius and all those who agree with Nicaea, God absolutely adhered to divine simplicity, but we can't say how this is possible. The Homoians argued that other solutions were better, but they struggled to come up with alternatives that got any traction. Rather, they fractured into separate camps that fought with each other as much as they fought with the pro-Nicene theologians. Ultimately, what they struggled with is how to strike the balance between infinity, simplicity, and impassibility that we talked about last week. Holmes discusses what we know of their proposals in this week's reading. Now, the most prominent and influential of the Homoians is Eunomius, which Holmes spends some time on, who bears some attention here. Eunomius didn't like ousia language, but also wanted to figure out how to characterize Jesus the Son in a way that matches with Scripture. He called God the ingenerate or unbegotten one, who has all the cool characteristics of God, infinitude, simplicity, impassibility, etc. Jesus the Son, rather than being of the same substance of the Father, which is impossible, according to Eunomius, because the Father is simple and cannot be divided, the Father instead begets the Son as an act of will. Jesus is therefore of a completely different substance as the Father. Jesus is not homoousia with the Father, or even like substance, homoiousia, but really made out of different stuff, but united to the Father in will and in action. Everything the Son has, therefore, is not because the Son is God and shares in the divine substance and attributes, but because God gifts these things to the Son. The Son has glory and power only because of what the Father has given, and should therefore be worshipped and glorified by every creature. The Spirit, which Eunomius also affirms, is the product of both the Father and the Son. The Son is well beneath and subordinate to the Father, and the Spirit is well beneath and subordinate to the Son, and yet both the Son and the Spirit are so far above everything in creation as to be incomparable. Can't compare to them. And yet Eunomius was still concerned about divine unity. But rather than making the genus-species argument of the Cappadocians, which is ultimately based on substance categories, Eunomius bases the unity of the three tiers, Father, Son, and Spirit, on their shared will and their shared actions. Since this will and action are discernible in history, Eunomius argues that we can fully describe God through observation and logic. This statement is the point at which the Cappadocians start to pry apart Eunomian theology because they believe that God is ineffable and the reality of a shared divine substance that we cannot fully comprehend or describe is the better way to engage in doctrines related to Father, Son, and Spirit. Eventually, Eunomianism and the rest of the Homoian theological effort was marginalized to the point of irrelevance, though it still springs up from time to time, and the language of Nicaea was ultimately and finally affirmed in the Church. So what are the particular affirmations of the first 4 centuries of effort in establishing Trinitarian doctrine? I've adapted this from Holmes' summary on page 146 of the text. I don't think you were assigned that for this week, but it's only 2 or 3 pages. It's maybe worth reading. And I want to walk through these one by one. The first thing that they landed on is that the divine nature is one. This is an affirmation of divine simplicity, which theologians came back to again and again and drove both developments within Trinitarian doctrine, and it also drove lots of debates. How could this actually be considered simple? This is a question that came up a lot. The second thing that they affirmed is that Trinitarian language uses analogies and different language tricks to describe the indescribable, but that the Trinitarian language is ultimately adequate and sufficient if it's understood and used properly. Third, they affirm that there are 3 and only 3 persons within God. This is intended to close down the question of why not 4 divine beings, and it binds us to revelation instead of speculation. Fourth, they affirm that each person of the Trinity is real and not a mode or a mask, that each person of the Trinity exists eternally, and so is not created, similar to Arianism or Eunomianism, and is necessary for God to be complete. They argue that there is no other divinity outside of the 3 persons of the Trinity. As a side note, Holmes argues that Eastern and Western Trinitarian developments are in line with each other, and on this point I agree. They're essentially getting at and talking about and aligning on the same things. The Eastern concept tends to start with the 3 revealed persons and then moves into oneness, which is a move a lot of modern theologians make. And because of that, the Eastern Church is a very social analogy of the Trinity. This social analogy of Father and Son makes understanding the eternal nature of the persons really hard. If the Son is begotten, then there must be a time, even if it's very short, where the Father exists without the Son, right? That's how fathership and sonship work. This, I believe, causes confusion and has generated a lot of the controversies that we see in Trinitarian development. Augustine in the West, however, he tended to start with the unity and then move to the 3 persons. This was more likely the path that most of the ancient church tended to take after they sort of adopted Augustine's structure. This changed the emphasis, but not necessarily the content of the debate. However, Augustine's psychological analogy was, I believe, a move to resolve the problem of eternity in the social trinity. A person, Augustine argues, has a psychological mode of being. They exist with a mind, with a heart, and with a will. A person is not a person without all 3 of these things, and so all 3 must exist simultaneously in order for there to be a person that we can even talk about. This makes personhood the simultaneous arrival of mind, heart, and will, which when applied to God, says that the 3 pieces, the 3 persons within God must exist from all eternity for there to even be a God that we are talking about. In this analogy, there's no question about timing like there is in the social analogy. That's what I think Augustine was doing with his psychological analogy. Fifth, the only meaningful distinction, the point that they wanted to make is that the only meaningful distinction between the persons of the Trinity is in their origin. God is unbegotten, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds. None of them can or should be called created because that implies time. Each person has existed from eternity as having their own particular origin. Sixth, what they affirmed is that whatever can be spoken of God can be spoken of all 3 persons of the Trinity. This is a little more difficult because it's clear that the Son has been incarnate. Can we say that God as a whole has been incarnate? Rather, I think that it's more appropriate to say that all three persons participated in the incarnation. The Father sent, the Son was sent, and the Spirit prepared the way. So there's ways in which that we can consider that no one hypostasis does anything alone. They all participate in everything except for their origin. 7. The only permissible distinctions in speaking about God are the distinctions in origin. Now, both the Holmes book and the Lacuna book are fantastic resources, and there's lots in both books that we haven't read. For instance, chapter 2 of Holmes goes into the scriptural underpinnings of the Trinity, which are significant and totally worth reading. Lacuna as well has a series of chapters on the early Trinitarian debates and how they played out, which is an excellent supplement to this week's reading. And at some point, I hope you go back to read this material. But here at the end, we've kind of determined what the first 4 centuries of debates in the church had to do with the Trinity. One, what we talked about in the last lecture, was that it was something that seemed to be assumed in our earliest writings, that this was already sort of a settled doctrine, even if the distinctiveness and exactly how it works out wasn't settled. And here, as debates raged at the end of the 4th century, we end up with these 7 distinctives that you can find on page 146 of the Holmes text. Now that we've established both the concerns of the early church in developing Trinitarian doctrine and how Trinitarian doctrine has been retrieved in the modern era, which was the focus of the earlier portions of this course with the Lacuna material, next week we'll have a brief exploration of how Trinitarian doctrine has been used in questionable ways and how the Trinitarian framework that we've tried to establish in this course can help us navigate the debate. So I hope that you enjoyed the reading this week. Don't forget about participation in the forum. Read the book that you've chosen as the text for your final paper. And as usual, send any questions to me in email. Thanks.